let's go ahead and get started.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to get started here. I'd just like to read you a little bit about Steve Key, who's here from Indianapolis today. He is an attorney and executive director of the Hoosier State Press Association, which represents daily and weekly paid circulation newspapers in Indiana. The organization provides legal advice, training, and other services for Indiana journalists. It also sponsors annual paid internships for college students who are considering a career in journalism. So some of you might be interested in that. You can go to their website and find out more information. Before becoming executive director of the HSPA, Steve served 17 years as an attorney and lobbyist for the organization. He is also a former journalist, having worked at newspapers across the Midwest for more than a decade. He has won several awards for his work, including the Louis Englehart Friend of Journalism Award from the Indiana High School Press Association and the Excellence in Public Information and Education Award from the Indiana Judges Association. I first became aware of Steve's work when I was a high school newspaper advisor in Indianapolis. High school journalists, college journalists, professional journalists, and citizens have a great champion in Steve Key, who is an evangelist for the cause of freedom of information, a freedom that is everyone's right, whether you're a journalist or not. So we're just going to ask Steve some questions, and I'll get things started off, and then I'm hoping that you, especially students here, will have some questions to ask too. So thanks for coming, Steve.
Glad to be here.
Driving in the rain. What kinds of information is publicly available that would be of interest to college students? What are some things that they may not be aware of that's out there?
Well, for college students, depending on where they're from, their hometowns, you've got information available through what's going on with your city government, your county government, at the state level, which impacts policies, whether it's economic development. There's a host of information available through the website of the General Assembly. When it gets to a private institution, the information that's required to be made available is going to be a little bit more constrained because you're not dealing with a public institution, a taxpayer-funded institution, but you're dealing with a private entity. So the information you can get available there is going to be a little bit limited. I mean, if you're talking about a journalist who's looking at trying to find a little bit about the university, all nonprofit entities have to file a tax form, and unlike your tax form, their tax form is publicly available, and they have to keep that around and be available. And with this tax form, you can find out a little bit about key individuals, how the money is being spent to a certain extent. So that's something I always would recommend for someone who's dealing with a charity or nonprofit, or if you're thinking about doing a charitable donation. You can get this information. They have to have it available on site and available for inspection. And if they're not making that available, then you may not want to be donating to that charity. The part of the rationale there is so that people can see how much money that's being donated is actually going to the cause, as opposed to how much is being eaten up by administrative expenses. So, it's called the 990 form, the tax form is, and that's something you can use. With DePaul University, I understand you do have a police department that has arrest powers. So there is certain information they're required to make available under the Clery Act, but I can tell you that what they're required to make available is much less specific information than the information that the Greencastle or Putnam County law enforcement agencies would have to give you, even though you might have the same type of crime being occurred and covered by all three of those departments. As far as what's required to be made available is much less under the federal Clery Act.
Okay, so the Form 990, where would that be available?
Well, I would go to the office of start with the office of the president, and if they don't have it, then they should know who would have it available. But it is supposed to be available, and for, I'm not sure how many years going back, but you should be able to get those.
And it's online too, right? You can get it online?
I don't know if you can get it online through DePaul, but I'm not sure exactly where it might be, but there is entities at like GuideStar or other places where you might be able to find nonprofits, 990, but I haven't really searched for a while, so I'm not sure.
Are there any other documents that that would be helpful to college journalists that they, at a private institution such as this one? Is there anything else besides the 990 that they should be looking at?
Now you're getting a little bit more specific than I
Yeah.
would know. With the question is are there any kind of reports that a private university has to file with a public agency? You know that's why the Clery Act falls under that. But if there are reports or items where that they have to have reports that go to, whether it's the U.S. Department of Education or if it's dealing with getting grants from a public agency or something, there could be some documents there. But we're talking, it just depends on what they're required to do. And then in those cases, you can get those then from the state or the federal agency because it becomes a public record. And under the Access to Public Records Act in Indiana, the presumption is that all records of public agencies are available for copy and inspection unless they can show you a state statute that says, no, we can keep this confidential.
And there are a lot of exemptions to that, right?
Each state has its own list of exemptions. It depends on what's happened and sparked the legislature in this state or that state to decide how much information is going to be available or not. So there are exceptions, but at least under Indiana's law, they can't just tell you no. They have to give you a statutory basis so that you can look at the statute and says, yeah, that makes sense, or you can call me and say, they said I can't have this because of this, and we can confirm whether or not you can get that record. You've also got the federal FERPA, which is the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act, and in Indiana they've kind of interpreted that a little bit more broadly than some other states. So that also adds some privacy concerns that can knock out information.
Okay. Now so information, if there's information that you're trying to get, for example, from a county agency or a city agency, is some of that available online, or do you have to go into the office and ask for it?
There is information available. A lot of financial information is available from the State Department of Local Government Finance, budget information, and other types of information. State Board of Accounts. Public agencies have to do a 100R form that tells how much compensation they've given to everyone. So if you're looking for that kind of information, you should be able to find it on the State Board of Accounts. If they filed it, there's not always the agencies remember to file it. So there's an attempt to get more and more information online. But still, the farther you get down, the smaller the government agency is. You're probably going to have to make that request either in person or in writing, either through an email or letter.
Okay. Should you expect to have to pay for this information?
Well, there is the ability to charge for a copying fee, but Indiana's copying fees is pretty inexpensive. It's basically 10 cents a page. For black and white, and if it has color, they can charge you up to 25 cents. So there are a couple exceptions to that, like the recorder's office. If you're like filing a deed or getting some information there, they can charge to $1. The court system is another place where the price was grandfathered in by the legislature, and so they can charge you up to $1. And then if you're getting an accident report, theirs is a quirky one where they're supposed to charge you at least a minimum of $4. And the last I checked, the city of Hammond was the leader at like $20 a copy for an accident report.
Wow.
So and the thinking in the legislature there is I think they thought that the insurance companies were going to pay for these accident reports, and so they were drawing money in to use for training funds. But the insurance companies got smart, and they just insist that you as a citizen go get your accident report so that they don't have to pay for it, you have to pay for it. and the legislature has never really changed from their language that they had. So that's the most expensive document generally.
What should people do? So they've read the statute, and by the way, Steve brought some great resource materials. This is the Handbook on Indiana's Public Access Laws, and then there's a little pocket size, kind of a digest. So before you leave here, be sure to grab one. What should you do if you know you have a right to information but it's being denied you?
Well, well, even if you're not sure but you think that you've been denied incorrectly from again, we're talking government agencies. There's an office called the Public Access Counselor, and that office serves as kind of a mediator and educator on the access laws, the open door law for meetings, and the Access to Public Records Act for any kind of records. And so if you think you've been denied, and you don't think that it's correct, they're there for you to basically contact, and you can ask for either a formal or informal opinion, and they'll check with the agency that's denied you and what the basis was for the denial, and what the records were that you requested, and then issue like I say, either it could be just a phone call back to you and say, here's the situation, or if you go to their website, you'll see that there'll be hundreds of formal opinions that they issue every year on whether or not there's been a violation or not of the statute. And the reason it's important that you reach the Public Access Counselor, is that Public Access Counselor is impartial. They don't have a dog in the fight on either side, so and they're experts in the field. But also, if it's a situation where you're really wanting to get this record and you get an opinion from the Public Access Counselor that says that you were denied improperly, and the public agency says, well, we don't really care what the Public Access Counselor says, we're still not going to give you that record, then you have the opportunity to go to court. But as long as you've gone to court after you've attempted to get the records through the Public Access Counselor, then if you're successful in your court case, the judge will be required to reimburse you for your attorney fees and court costs. If you go straight to court without checking through the Public Access Counselor first, then the judge would be prohibited from giving you attorney fees and court costs even if you won the case. So the whole idea was to try to funnel all the disputes through the Public Access Counselor's office, because 9 times out of 10, if there's an error been made, it's not been made intentional, and the agency will give you the record once they find out that they should, or they'll quit violating the open door law, so that we narrow down the actual cases that actually have to go to court, are either going to be cases where there really is a legitimate question of law and how it should be interpreted in this particular case, or you have the case where you've got a bad actor who says, I don't care what the Public Access Counselor says, I don't care what your rights are, I'm not going to give you that record, and they're basically trying to call the bluff of whoever's asking for it, because in many cases somebody will just walk away and say, if they're told no, and they won't really fight it and go and exert their rights through the court.
I've got the Public Access Counselor website up here, and it's not reproducing very well, but it looks pretty bad. There is a place on here where there's the request for information, right?
There should be a form on there, or if you want to make a request for an opinion, and that you should be able to call up a form and you can fill it in. Let's see, there's annual contacts us.
Can you guys read that in the back of the room?
Is the remote up there, Kathy?
No. Anyway, it's PAC it's a government website, .in.
Yeah.
.gov, PAC Public Access Counselor, and it's a great site because it's easy for the layperson to use. So if you go into, if you're looking at the statute itself, it's kind of it's kind of wonky. It's hard to figure out.
You might click on Contact Us and see if that's where it tells you how to do. See if that gives you where you can go.
Where is it?
It's your
Oh, there
arrows,
it is.
yeah, right there.
I see it. Oh, no, it doesn't. So there's kind of a basic form, right?
Yeah.
If you're requesting information.
Yeah, if you're requesting an opinion, they basically want you to file. It starts the paperwork, so they know what your basis of your request is, and then they'll know what agency you've reached out to, so they can reach out to them, get their side of the story.
How does Indiana's access laws compare to the laws of other states? Access laws in other states?
Well, I haven't seen anything real recent, but in the past there's been a couple of comparisons of state to state, and in one, Indiana was in tied for 13th best. In another one, it was with different criteria, it was in the top 5. So it's pretty good. I mean, there are always things. If they let me write the law, I might be a little different, and I might think it's a little bit better. But legislation's always a fight between competing interests. And any time that the Hoosier State Press Association is trying to do an improvement, we usually run into opposition with the Association of Indiana Counties, or the Indiana School Board Association, or the it's now called AIM, Accelerate Indiana Municipalities. Sometimes it's the public universities who don't want things different than what they are now, and they may be opposed to a little bit greater level of transparency. So those are our usual suspects when it comes to a fight over getting access to information.
What are some of the trends in Indiana? Access is in the news. It's been in the news. It seems like there are a few cases every year that are in the headlines where there's some kind of battle for information. What are some of the latest ones been?
Well, as far as battles in the last, or things that are going in the last couple of years, and it's not always just the legislature. Some things happen out in the courts. There was recently, the most recent case that we were involved with was the ESPN versus the University of Notre Dame case, where ESPN was trying to get some information about some crime reports. I think they were trying to determine whether or not football team players were maybe treated a little different if they were the accused in a crime report as opposed to other students. The ESPN was arguing that the Notre Dame Police Department, since it had arrest power, should fall under the statute like city police departments and county police departments, and what level of information they have to report. Where Notre Dame took the position that that they were not a police department under the scope of the Access to Public Records Act, and all they had to report was what's required under that federal Clery Act that we talked about. Much different level of information it's made available, and so ended up going to the Supreme Court, and ESPN lost the battle, and part of it goes to the wording of the statute. When the statute was worded, there were no university police departments. A police department was the police department everybody considers, city, sheriff, state, and universities back then didn't have police departments with arrest powers. They might have had security officers who would check on things, but if it was something serious, they'd be calling in the local police for that. So the way the wording was worded, I could see where the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, came down with its decision. Meanwhile, at the same time, the group that represented all the private universities were working in the legislature to get a change in the statute to basically clarify that they didn't fall under the Access to Public Records Act, and that they would report basically what the Clery Act required. So basically codified what the federal law was. So there is that dichotomy, so that if you had a situation where a young woman suffered from a sexual assault, let's say in Greencastle somewhere, if it's handled by the Greencastle Police Department, the public will, if it's reported by the newspaper, whatever, the public will know whether or not was it a date rape situation, was it a case where she was walking across the campus late at night and was attacked, Was it a case where somebody broke into her residence off campus or whatever? And you'd have all that information so that all the other co-eds in the similar situation could basically assess the situation and say, okay, I got to be careful about either walking late at night or locking my doors or being very careful about who I'm going out with. Whereas if it's handled by the DePaul University Police Department, because they only have to report what's in the Clery Act, all you'll know is that there was a report of a sexual assault, but you won't have any kind of details about exactly where or what the factual circumstances were unless they voluntarily give it up. But they would not be required to make that information available to the public like the Greencastle Police Department would.
So I know the Clery Act comes out every fall, and student journalists are always looking at that report, so it does have its limitations.
Well, that's there's the annual report, and I believe they also they are required to do kind of a running kind of a log, so that you don't have to wait till 12 months to find out that there was an assault that happened back 11 months ago. So, I know that someone was showing me kind of what they have on the line, and it's kind of a dispatch log that talks about when the call came in. Very, very little information about what the call was about, but that's pretty much about what you could expect from the Clery Act. Anything above that is something that the police department is doing voluntarily to be more transparent, which should be applauded.
Okay. DePaul has the unfortunate distinction of wrestling right now with a serious alcohol abuse problem, and the newspaper is focused on that story. Are there any public records or public agencies that you would recommend that they touch base with to get some information?
You might check with the State Department of Health to see what kind of aggregate stats that they might have concerning alcohol issues, and because there may be some things there that may be broken down by county or city or what as far as incidents. I'm not sure if the information that's gathered by law enforcement agencies that generally are collected by the Indiana State Police, I'm not sure to the detail what they might have as far as alcohol-related incidents, particularly if you're breaking it down by like a college campus. So that's going to be a tough one, because I'm just not sure what kind of detail they get down to as far as when information's reporting, where you could be able to break it out and find out information that would be DePaul University specific.
Okay.
It sounds like, from what I saw, it looks like the DePaul Police Department went on their log, or they may be, specifying if it's an alcohol-related incident. So if you worked with them going back over the log over a time period, you might have to physically count, but that's reporting. It can be tedious and all, but you might be able to get a good number there as far as how many calls and incidents that they have to deal with that are alcohol related. And of course, you can then run a comparison to what's the size of the student body population to get a feel for how many calls per in comparison to how many students that you have. But you also might have to back out if it's they may have an alcohol related incident, but it may refer to somebody who's not a student. It may be somebody who's in the community but is cutting across the campus or whatever. But it kind of gets back to to something that anybody in journalism needs to know, that, and in particular in the situation here where you don't have the same amount of information that you can go in and say, you have to give me this information. So it's going to put a greater pressure on the student journalists is to develop relationships, so that you're working with the head of the the campus police department, or the person in the admissions office, or the different deans in the different schools, so that they have a good understanding that when they talk to you, that they know what you're trying to do, and that you're not trying to be sensational, but you're just trying to cover a legitimate story, and that you're going to give that story a full breadth of your journalistic efforts as far as trying to get what the different sides are, and present different points of view if it's a controversy, because if it wasn't a controversy, there wouldn't be everybody be in agreement. So you got to develop those relationships, and you develop a relationship not just with the head of the department, but I always recommend it's always good to know that person who's the first person you walk into the office, because they're the gatekeepers. If you come in and are kind of snotty to them, or kind of looking down at the lowly clerk or whatever, you're going to have a lot harder time getting past that person to be able to see the dean or the chief or whoever it is that you're trying to see. So a lot of journalism is being basically treating people with respect and dignity, so that they understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Reed?
Given our current political climate and the changing world of journalism, what would you say is the most important thing to remember or take into account when you're accessing records like these?
Well, the important thing about accessing records is that it serves to verify the source that you're talking to. If somebody says that there's an opioid issue in the county, or there's an alcohol problem, where's the records, the research that backs that up? There's the old saying, trust but verify. You build a relationship with the source, and they've proven to be a good source, but you also want to do your homework and follow up and making sure that the documents support what's being said. So that's always important. As far as being just a journalist, even though things have changed, your number one priority for personally as a journalist is always to be credible. Your credibility is everything that you're not going to be able to accomplish anything if you can't be trusted. If the police chief says, hey, I want to give you a little background on this case, but I want to do it off the record so that you can understand why we're not being as forthcoming with this information, and you turn around and you publish that information that you said that was going to be off record, that police chief will never, if they talk to you at all, which they don't have to, if they do, they'll never trust you again. I mean, you can work and build your credibility incrementally over time, and if you really mess it up, it drops it back to zero, and it'll take you forever to rebuild it. So, always be honest with the people you deal with, treat them with respect. Do the best that you can on the story, whether it's a 2-paragraph brief on the inside or if it's a front page story, because if people don't trust you, they don't trust your newspaper or your website or your television station or whatever. If they don't trust you, A, they're not going to deal with you from a source standpoint, and B, if you'll lose your readership or your viewership because people don't believe what you're saying. So credibility and maintaining your credibility and your has always been the key to being an effective journalist.
Other questions?
When you were talking about law enforcement earlier, you specifically said that there is a certain amount of things that they have to release, that anything above that should be applauded as what they're releasing. What kind of restrictions do you think are necessary with any information that should be withheld?
Well, I mean, even for a city or state, there is an investigatory records exception that allows them to keep certain information confidential to protect their investigation. You know, it doesn't serve them to release the name of the suspect that they're going to arrest, who happens to be a over-the-road trucker, because if his family calls him and says, well, the paper said that they're looking to arrest you, he may not come back from California if he knows that there's an arrest warrant out for him. There's been cases where police departments have wanted to keep a particular bit of the investigation secret because they know it, and the person who committed the crime knows it, so they may want to keep that one little fact confidential, so that if they're interviewing somebody and they happen to mention this information, they know that they've got somebody. There was a case a couple of years ago that they ended up making an arrest in Martinsville. There was a young black woman who was killed. It was 20, 30 years ago, and a woman came forward and said, I think my father did this, and she was able to describe a particular article of clothing that the woman had that the police had kept secret. So when she was able to describe that piece of clothing, that was a scarf, I believe.
She was in the car.
She was in the car, and she described the scarf, and the police had never released the information about that scarf. So when they heard that, they knew that she was a credible witness that was that they could rely upon. They ended up making an arrest on that. Like I say, it was 30, 35 years or something since the woman had been killed. So the legislature, while it takes the presumption that public records of public agencies, state agencies are available for inspection and copying, they also recognize that there are going to be certain subject matters that they should give the discretion to an agency to keep certain things confidential, or there's certain things that they require them to keep confidential, like your Social Security numbers. Those are required, even though they might be on a public record. They have to be redacted out before those are made available. Medical records are another item where those are supposed to be kept confidential. So they've tried to balance between some aspects of privacy of individuals, the ability for the agency to do the job it has to do, particularly police departments, and then balancing that out with the public's right to know what their agencies are doing and how they're spending their taxpayer dollars and those things. So there's a balance there.
Is there a place where people can go to find out the kinds of information that are available about them? Is there a way for anybody in this room to know, here's what's out there for you, on you, or here's the kind of thing that could be available?
There's not like a clearinghouse, where like you could go to state government clearinghouse and type your name in and find out what they have. I mean, obviously there's if you're Googling your name, you're going to find out a lot of information that's available out there. Probably one of the biggest collector of information is LexisNexis, and they collect a lot of data out of public records from all over the country, and then they sell that data to whether it's insurance companies or banks or title companies to try to determine whether or not they want to give you a loan or approve a mortgage. There are some employers who can, they can get that information to see whether or not somebody has had a felony arrest, and so there's not like a public website where you could go to find out. You can even, but each agency, you can make a records request, with your name. But there's a lot of agencies out there. There are people who still who may have been active politically back in the 1970s who go and check the FBI to see what kind of file, if there's any file on them in the FBI. For some of them, it's almost like a badge of courage that I've got an FBI file on me. but you know, the information's available, but there's not one clearinghouse that I could point you to.
With Indiana, you mentioned fees for copying. If an organization, a state agency or local agency has the information in an electronic format, are they required to give it to you that way? Can they charge you for that?
They are not required to give you an electronic copy, and that's something that we are hoping to change, and we've tried to change it in a bill last couple of years, but it was tied to a search fee that the last two governors vetoed kind of at the last minute. But they're required to give you the information that's in an electronic file. But as it stands now, they can control whether or not they give it to you in paper form or electronic. You've probably been reading a lot about Governor Pence's emails. Well, when he gave his emails that were on his AOL accounts, he didn't give them to them in electronic format. He gave it to them in paper. So it's taking a lot longer for them to sort through those. And the same could happen to you if you went to Greencastle and said, I'd like a copy of the budget, which you know is in an Excel spreadsheet. They could say, well, you have a right to it, but they don't necessarily have to give it to you as an attachment on email. They could print it out, make you go down to the City Hall and get a paper copy and then try to recreate it yourself. We are trying to get that flipped around. The problem in the past has been the opposition of the county recorders. County recorders are in an odd situation in that a few years ago they were allowed to charge this $1 copy fee, and it was supposed to go to their records perpetuation fund to make sure they could put old records and keep the records on microfiche for decades and decades and decades. Well, they started making so much money, they started getting new furniture in some offices, and they'd have this kind of a slush fund for flowers if somebody died at a funeral. Well, then the county commissioners caught on to how much money the recorders were getting from their copying fees, that they basically quit funding them through the general taxes. So now the recorders are very dependent upon that copying fee to maintain their office. So anything that comes up legislatively that might threaten their $1 copy fee, they'll go ballistic. So if we try to switch it so that it's the citizen who can say, I know you've got this in electronic format, would you send it to me by email? We're probably going to have to basically exempt the recorders from that right. But with everybody else, it would save them time, save you time. There would be no copying fee because they're not making a hard paper copy, so it's not costing them anything to copy. And there's not really any opposition to the concept. It's just that we got tied to, it was kind of it got tied to this search fee, which was a good thing for local governments, not as good for citizens. And we tied something good for citizens that the local governments weren't that excited about. But then the whole bill got vetoed 2 years in a row. As it stands now, there is the local government, if you go in and you ask for a lot of information or information, it's going to take them hours to go back and go up into the courthouse attic and find bankers' boxes and go through thousands of pages to try to meet your request. All that time to search, they can't charge you for. All they can charge you for is then if they make a copy for you, the 10-cent copying fee. And so that's been a complaint from local and state bureaucrats for decades that, we're using up all these resources to satisfy these search requests and we can't recoup any of our costs for it. And so HSPA worked with the Speaker of the House, Brian Bosma, because, to try to see if we could craft something that would be fair, because it's not unprecedented. 27 states and the Federal Freedom of Information Act all have search fees language of different types. And so we tried to craft something that would be as little a burden on the public as possible, but we also coupled it in with the ability for you to get the records electronically in that format. And we passed, the language has passed the House 3 times, the Senate 3 times, but the last 2 years, kind of at the last minute and unexpectedly, each governor had vetoed it because of the search fee. They felt that was an additional burden to access. So I can't necessarily argue for what their motives were, but if they had really talked to us, we could explain to them what we had put together and how balanced. Interesting, the biggest problems for local and state government when it comes to these voluminous records requests are political parties, because they're doing opposition research. So they're wanting to see everything that a elected official has done to see if they can find something that they can use against that incumbent in the next election.
How much public documentation is online? Like, are you better off just going directly to a state house and getting these records, or are they accessible easily online?
Well, accessible and easy cannot necessarily be the same thing, because there are some, on some websites, there's going to be information there, but it's not going to be real easy to find. You got to go through layer after layer after layer, and you really have to know what you're looking for. What if you're looking to do a story and you know an agency's got records. If you're talking from a journalist or even from a citizen standpoint, your best bet may be to call their media relations person and say, hey, I'm looking for some information, and that person, if it's there, they'll say, oh, well, that's on our website. You can go, and they'll help you find it, because then they don't have to worry about a records request and copying and all that. Or if it's not, then you can work with them to, what I suggest, you can work with them to try to narrow down the records that will help you. Sometimes reporters they don't want to tip off the story they're doing, so they'll make these records requests that are really do take a lot of work for a public official, and so they're going off and they bring you a 1,000 documents when really maybe only 10 really address what you needed. So if you know the specific records, the more specific and focused your records request is, the faster you're going to get the information back, and the less records you're going to have to wade through to actually get the information. Now, sometimes you don't know what record it is that you exactly need. So, but again, I suggest, like on emails, if you're, instead of saying I want all the emails from this person for a certain time period, well, that could be hundreds and hundreds, where if you could narrow it down, say, okay, I need all the records between the school superintendent and the school board president between a time period. That'll be a lot fewer records. And then from that, you may see some information and say, oh, okay, now I need to see the emails that the superintendent had with this person, because that was referenced here. So you might have to make a follow-up thing, but you'll still end up with maybe 20 documents that you're looking at, as opposed to 300 documents, with most of them being nothing that you can really use, and you're just taking a lot of time to try to read through.
I found the letter generator.
Oh, you did?
It's on the screen. So this kind of walks you through the format if you're going to make a records request. Mm-hmm. And I think you were getting at that concept of reasonable particularity.
Yeah, if you're too vague, you'll just get a general denial saying you're, and unfortunately there are 2 Court of Appeals opinions that had different definitions of what reasonable particular are. But the one that a lot of the agencies will depend upon, like with email, say that you can't just ask for all the email from to John and from John Smith for a time period. You have to have somebody else at the other end, and then so it's a little bit more limited there. But the other Court of Appeals opinion basically took the same rules that they use for discovery and said, if I as a public official understand what you're asking for, that's reasonably particular. But unfortunately, this other one is a lot more cramped, and that's what we have to deal with. And to avoid wasting time getting a response back just saying your records request is being denied for lacking reasonable particularity. Yes?
What would you say is the most interesting public records to look at that people probably don't pay attention to? If you were trying to look up for like story, like what would be the, I want to say like most fun or like easiest public records that you could look at if you wanted to find something?
Well, this is a little bit different from what you're asking, but I would say the information that a lot of people miss that they should be keeping track of is called public notice advertising, or the legals. That the General Assembly has decided there's certain information that's so important that the local government agency or state agency is required to publish a notice in the newspaper to let the citizens know that the agency is either planning to do something or considering or has decided to do something. So, it can be a notice of a hearing on a change in the zoning for an area. It can be a notice to let people know that somebody has died, and so that if either you're a possible heir or somebody that person owed you money, that you have an opportunity to file a claim. Anytime a public agency is requesting a proposal to do something, they have to publish the request for proposal. Or if they're purchasing a fire truck, they have to put in a request for a bid on the fire truck. So there's a host of information that the government agencies are required to give anybody, and all they have to do is open up the paper and see that. But as far as what's interesting information people should look at, it's all going to depend on where they are in life and what they're interested in. If you're in your early 20s, you should be following what's going on with all the health care debate, because one of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act was that it allows people to be kept on their parents' insurance up to 24, I think, 24, 26. So if that all goes away, you could have a lot of people who are basically are independent from their parents, and they're at school, and they have no access to insurance because they can't be kept on their parents' insurance. So for somebody that age, health care, it doesn't sound like health care would be an issue for you because everybody's pretty healthy. But if you were in a car accident or something like that, you don't have insurance, it could have a devastating impact on you and the level of care that you get. If you're older, well, then now you have kids, well, now you get more interested in what's the quality of education in your local schools. So there may be information you want to look at there. If you buy a house, well, now you're a little bit more interested in what's happening with property taxes, because depending on how efficient the government is and the projects they've got, they can radically impact your tax rates. Right now, Indiana's in a good economic development position because the tax rates in Indiana are a lot better than they are in Illinois, because Illinois is in some financial issues. So you're seeing the state of Indiana advertising in Illinois to businesses to move over because they can get a better tax deal here. So a lot of it depends on where you are in your life and what your interests are as far as what you may want to follow. If you're worried about the environment, you may be wanting to check to see what's going on with the Department of Environmental Management. I think they have a different commissioner now than was the commissioner under Governor Pence, but I remember the Commissioner Easterly under Governor Pence, who basically publicly said his role was to make it easier for business to get their permits. They didn't say a word about anything about protecting the environment or protecting the health and safety of Hoosiers, but that's what his number one goal is. So following what's going on with different agencies, depending on what your interest is, whether it's if it's the outdoors and you're interested in the Department of Natural Resources, or or for the Department of Environmental Management, or in Department of Economic Development. There are a lot of different agencies. A lot of them, it's going to depend on what your interests are.
We have a local board here of a small government agency who is receiving 3 to 5 public access requests a week.
Uh-huh.
They're pretty complicated and obscure. What advice would you give to this board to help with that kind of a situation where the law is being
Well, that can be a problem. I've heard those issues before, where people they're certain either disgruntled citizens or former employees or political opponents, whatever, who try to use the Access to Public Records Act almost as a punishment. The problem is that it's like the freedom of speech. You can't pick and choose who has the freedom of speech. Whether the person is a white supremacist or a good person, you can't say you don't have the right to speak your opinion. Same falls with requests that come in. You can't take a request and say, well, I know you're just trying to cause us problems, and so so we're going to deny you your request. Now, there are different ways to deal with the request. I mean, one is that if they're requesting the same information over and over again, you're only required to give them the information once. So you can say, this information you requested 2 months ago, and we've already given it to you. If the records you're not concerned about the records containing like information that you'd have to redact or keep confidential, there's nothing to prevent you from coming in and say, we'll be glad to help facilitate your request. If you'll come into the office, we'll put the banker's box in front of you, and you can go through and you can find the information that you're seeking. While you've got somebody watching to make sure they're not destroying records. But other than that, you're going to have to still go through those records requests, and if they're information that you're required to make confidential, then you tell them that, we have to deny you this because of this. If it's information that you have the discretion to keep confidential, then, whatever your policy is on those records, you can keep those records confidential. But if they are public records that are disclosable to anybody who requests them, then you're going to have to take the time. Now, the time frame, is the way the legislature looks at it is that producing records for the public is part of your regular duties of a public official. So they are going to have to accommodate, but they also have to do all their other duties. So they have to figure out how long it's going to take to work those records in. If they're voluminous records requests, it's going to take a while. Then you let this requester know. You say, okay, we will be getting these records to you, but because of the volume of the records involved, it's going to take some time. And what we'll do is that, every month or every couple of weeks, we will provide you with the records that we've been able to find thus far.
That's a valid reason. The number of requests that this agency has been receiving, that's a valid.
It's not a valid reason to deny the request, but it's a valid to take your time in getting it back. You don't have to drop everything else that you're doing to answer one records request. The other thing you can do is that if they're making a records request that is voluminous and it's going to be 100 pages, or you estimate it's going to be 1,000 pages when done, you can request that they pay the copying fee up front for what you expect, to make sure you don't get burned, because there have been situations where somebody will make a big records request and they'll have the stack of papers and they call the person and say, okay, you can come and get in, and they say, I've changed my mind. So you've spent all the hours of work involved, and then they're just basically jerking your chain. So if you have a feel for how many documents that you end up going to be copying for them, you can request the copying fee up front. And sometimes that will to kind of get rid of some of the harassing type of requests.
They're currently, their lone employee is setting aside 1 day a week just to deal with the request. So, can they use that? I mean, it's not an excuse, but is that a valid reason to say the reasonable amount of time to fulfill these requests will take longer?
Yeah.
due to the volume? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're not required to go out and hire a new employee just to deal with the records requests. I mean, obviously, it sounds like this is a special situation. I mean, if you had an agency that often had, just had lots of people had records requests, then they should be budgeting to have enough manpower to handle that. But if you've got kind of an unusual situation like this, then yeah, you can explain to them that we are processing, but it's going to take a while because we only have one full-time person in the office and they have to do their other duties too, so it's going to take them a little bit longer to work through it. Or like I say, have them come in and have them go through the records if it's a type of records that they could go through without, unless you're worried about destruction of records or things along those lines. But yeah, the time frame is reasonable. What's a reasonable time frame? And if you only have one employee and they're supposed to be working, all these other items, and this is part of it, now it would be reasonable to say it's going to take a while to get those records. But I wouldn't, in that case, I wouldn't wait and say, we're not giving you any records until we get all of them done. I would, say, okay, here's the first batch, and we're continuing to work. Because then that shows a good faith effort that you are trying to respond to the records requests, not just stall them forever. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
You guys have been easy.
What should we have asked?
Well, that depends on what you're working on. The main things is to keep in mind with both Open Door Law and Access to Public Records Act is that the effectiveness of this depends on the public. Because there is nobody out there who's enforcing the statute. You can't, if you've been denied a record, you can't go to the state police and say, I want you to make them stop it. You don't go to your county prosecutor, you don't go to your attorney general. If you think that somebody is violating the Open Door Access to Public Records Act, it's up to the citizens, the public, or the media, who's ever watching them, to call them out and say, wait a minute, this isn't right. I just got a call today from a reporter, and they have a city council that wants to have an executive session, and when you have an executive session, you have to give notice of that executive session and say what your subject matter is, because only certain subject matters can be discussed behind closed doors. Well, the subject matter the city council is using is school consolidation. They don't own a school. The city doesn't have a school. So, I've, I explained to the reporter that no, this is not a valid basis to have an executive session. They should challenge them on it. They should let the public access counselor know, if they're going to ignore their complaint that this is in violation, because the reporter was told that the Indiana, or that their attorney had told the city council that they could use this. And I said, no, get the public access counselor, but if they're going to ignore the public access counselor, then it's going to be up to that reporter's newspaper, if they want to stop it, is that they're going to have to go to the court and say, give us an injunction to stop them from violating the statute, if they're not going to do it willingly. So because of that, then it's important that everybody knows that the presumption is that governing bodies of public agencies will meet in public, and if they want to meet behind closed doors, they have to give you notice and tell you what the subject matter is, and point to the code site that says allows them to meet behind closed doors. The same is with public records. The presumption is that all the records of a public agency should be available for inspection and copying, and if they're going to deny you access, they have to show you what state law that they're relying upon to prevent you from seeing that record. So, too many citizens don't understand that, and so they go in, they'll ask for a record, and they're told, no, you can't have it, and they say, oh, okay, and they'll walk out, and they don't even challenge it or make sure that that there's a legitimate reason for that denial. You know, as far as with this group, because you're in a private institution, you know, this institution has a history of supporting journalism efforts. You know, the Society of Professional Journalists was founded here. So I think that gives student journalists a little bit more leverage when they're working with the school officials, you know, to say, okay, you're not by statute or anything required to give me this information or be transparent, but following in the tradition of DePaul University, you know, why can't you share us this information to be more transparent and let people know, you know, so they can better support the whatever you're trying to accomplish. So again, it gets back to what I talked about earlier, is building those relationship, and you still have, you know, kind of the bully pulpit. You know, if people are not sharing information and they don't have a legitimate reason not to share that information, that's always fodder for an editorial or a story outlining, you know, the fact that that information is not being forthcoming. So that brings a little bit more pressure too, you know, if to a private institution, you know, so that they can justify why they're not wanting to share information or be more transparent. And they may have some very good reasons, but at least, you know, make sure that the reasons are legitimate.
So before you leave here, find out what your rights are and grab one of those booklets, so that if somebody denies you a record, you don't turn around and say, okay, thanks anyway. Well, thanks, Steve, for coming.
I enjoyed it. Hope it was helpful.